What if the service you trust the most is nothing more than a stage, polished, rehearsed, but already abandoned? What if the prayers you whisper rise like smoke, only to collapse back into your lungs, leaving you breathless and uncertain whether heaven even heard? Bonhoeffer walked into sanctuaries where every hymn shook the rafters and every pew was full, yet he felt the strange hush of vacancy. Not quiet, not reverence, but the hush that accuses, the silence of a throne unattended. He once hinted at a single sign that reveals when Christ has already walked away, and before this journey ends, that sign will find you. Until then, sit inside the tension. You have been told that a service is alive when the crowd is loud, when the stage is bright, when the preacher's words roll like thunder. But Bonhoeffer knew the difference between thunder and presence. He saw sermons that sounded holy but carried no weight, prayers that touched lips but never reached obedience. He knew that sound without surrender is only an echo in a hollow chamber. The frightening part is not the emptiness itself, it is how convincing the performance feels. And perhaps you have felt it too, that haunting suspicion that what looks alive might in truth be lifeless. Can you remember a moment when the music moved you, yet left you strangely untouched? When the sermon stirred your mind, but never pierced your will? Hold that memory. Do not rush past it. Because Bonhoeffer believed such moments were not accidents, they were signals, warnings that what appears sacred may already be uninhabited. He dared to say that most services, even those bathed in scripture and song, were weightless frames, altars without occupants. If that is true, then what does it say about us now? And so the question becomes unbearable. If he entered our sanctuaries today, would Bonhoeffer see anything different? Would he find Christ enthroned at the center, or would he whisper the same word he once spoke with sorrow, hollow, vacant, rehearsed without a witness? The answer will not come quickly, and perhaps it should not, because only those who dare to remain inside this tension will hear the sign he spoke of, the one sound that heaven never ignores. Until then, every word, every hymn, every heartbeat is an interrogation. Are we filled or merely occupied by ourselves? It was the year 1937, and the night air over Finkenwald carried the weight of fear. Inside an old hidden house that had been turned into an underground seminary, the windows were blackened, the candles burned low, and a handful of young men gathered around a wooden table. They were pastors in training, but also fugitives in spirit, hunted by a regime that demanded their silence. The Gestapo could have burst through the door at any moment, yet they whispered their prayers with trembling voices, voices that seemed to rise higher than the roof, into a heaven that felt nearer than breath. Bonhoeffer sat among them, listening, not to the strength of their tone, but to the surrender woven through every word. These prayers were not polished. They were not safe. They carried the raw ache of men who knew obedience might cost them everything, even their lives. The room had no organ, no choir, no dazzling lights. Yet it felt charged, alive with a presence he could not deny. And in that fragile circle of defiance, Bonhoeffer felt more of God than in the cathedrals that roared with empty thunder. That night, he wrote in his journal that many services in Germany were rehearsed performances, weightless, hollow shells dressed as worship. But here, in this candlelit silence, he recognized what the church had forgotten, that true worship is not measured by volume or beauty, but by the cost of obedience. He saw that presence is not guaranteed by gathering, but by surrender. And as the candlelight flickered across their faces, he understood why most services felt deserted, because Christ refuses to dwell where men refuse to yield. This image never left him. Even as he later walked the corridors of prisons and heard the chants of crowds, he remembered that hidden room, the one place where fear and faith collided, and Christ was still enthroned. That memory became his compass, the measure by which he judged every sanctuary he entered. And it still raises the question for us: if presence was found there, in weakness and danger, what excuse remains for us, who fill our sanctuaries with noise but leave him no place to stay? They gather every week, don't they? Hands lifted, voices rising, words rehearsed until they shine like polished glass. From the outside, it looks alive, almost unshakable. But Bonhoeffer warned us that appearances deceive. He had seen churches roaring with patriotic hymns, their altars draped in symbols of power rather than surrender, their pulpits echoing what the people wanted to hear instead of what God had already spoken. He called them weightless frames, sanctuaries filled with noise but deserted at the center. And his question pierces even now. How many of our services are nothing more than mirrors reflecting ourselves back to ourselves, while the one they claim to honor is absent? The paradox is unbearable. To mistake the heat of emotion for the fire of the Spirit, to confuse the thunder of a crowd with the presence of Christ. Bonhoeffer knew that worship could be counterfeited, that religion could become theater, that whole congregations could be deceived by their own sincerity. He pressed the wound deeper. The danger is not in silence, but in sound that hides withdrawal, in choruses that cover vacancy, in sermons that baptize ambition. What if that's happening now? What if the service that moved you to tears last Sunday was already uninhabited? The thought lingers like a shadow. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And still, there is the haunting loop he left behind. Bonhoeffer spoke of a single sound Christ never ignores. It is not the thunder of applause. It is not the volume of our songs. It is something quieter, more costly, something that trembles at the edge of obedience. You will hear it before this journey ends, but not yet. For now, sit in the tension. Let the suspicion grow. Let the hollow resonance of rehearsed worship unsettle you until you cannot stand it anymore. Because that ache, that dissonance inside your chest, might be the very place where presence begins again. So the question returns, heavier each time. If he walked into our sanctuaries today, would Bonhoeffer recognize them as churches? Or would he bow his head in sorrow and whisper the same word he once did, hollow? The answer is not given in statistics or programs. It is found only in the hidden measure, the unseeable weight of surrender. And until we face that measure, every service we attend remains an interrogation. Every hymn becomes a mirror, and every prayer is a question. Do we host Christ, or do we perform without him? The echo lingers, and it demands to be answered. They say life pulses in the sanctuary when the music swells, when the preacher's voice shakes the air, when the crowd rises to its feet as one. But Bonhoeffer, with eyes sharpened by suffering, knew better. He had walked into cathedrals where the choirs thundered and the stained glass glowed, yet he felt only the weight of vacancy pressing against his chest. He recognized that worship can be counterfeited, that devotion can be staged, that a whole congregation can mistake its own reflection for the presence of God. The danger is not in the emptiness we see, but in the fullness we celebrate, while Christ himself is unseen. And still, the illusion comforts us. We cling to it because it feels safe. As long as the seats are filled and the lights are warm, we convince ourselves that he must be here. But Bonhoeffer warned that such safety is nothing but anesthesia, numbing the soul, silencing conviction, lulling us into sleep. He wrote that services without obedience become like hollow rituals, weightless ceremonies repeated until they sound holy but leave no imprint on the heart. Imagine it, voices raised in unison but not in surrender, hands lifted high but not in sacrifice. Prayers whispered but never answered because they were never truly offered. What happens to a soul shaped by such worship? It begins to wither while thinking it thrives. It begins to confuse applause with presence, repetition with reverence, emotion with transformation. This is the deception Bonhoeffer saw, not outside the church, but within its very walls. And he named it, even when naming it made him an enemy. He stood against a church that loved the rhythm of religion more than the risk of obedience. And his warning reverberates now. A service can feel alive, yet still be lifeless. A congregation can be crowded, yet still abandoned. The measure is not the noise we produce, but the surrender we embody. And so the loop returns, circling tighter, pulling us deeper. Bonhoeffer knew there was one sound Christ never ignores. It is not the sound of 1,000 voices repeating his name. It is not the thunder of sermons rehearsed to perfection. It is something quieter, something weightier, something that cannot be faked. We have not reached it yet, but it waits ahead. The sound that divides worship from performance, presence from absence, truth from illusion. Until then, let this tension grow inside you. Let it test every song you sing, every prayer you whisper. Because once you hear that sound, nothing will ever feel the same again. Bonhoeffer once wrote that the church is only the church when it exists for others, when it lays itself down, when it surrenders every pretense of power, when it bends before the cross rather than basking beneath the lights. And here, finally, we arrive at the sound he knew Christ never ignores. It is not the roar of 1,000 voices. It is the trembling of a heart that yields. It is surrender, raw, unpolished, costly. It is the whisper of obedience, the quiet ache of sacrifice, the stillness that says, "Not my will, but yours." That is the one sound that cannot be counterfeited, the one sound that pierces heaven even when all else feels empty. This is why he dared to call most services hollow. Not because the music was wrong, not because the preaching was weak, but because obedience was absent. The room could be alive with energy, but if no one walked out changed, if no one bore the cross into their Monday, then the service remained a rehearsal without a witness. Bonhoeffer saw that God does not measure worship by the sound of our voices, but by the shape of our lives. A congregation that sings without surrender is a choir in an empty hall, echoing endlessly but never ascending. And yet, this revelation is not meant to crush us. It is meant to awaken us. Emptiness can become invitation. Vacancy can become doorway. Bonhoeffer believed that even in a dark age, even under a regime that silenced truth, a remnant could rise whose worship was not noise but offering. That whisper of surrender could still be heard above the chants of the crowd, above the hollow echoes of rehearsed religion. And that whisper still can be heard today if we dare to let go of the illusions we love. So the loop closes, not as an ending, but as a beginning. The question now is not whether our services are polished, but whether they are inhabited. Not whether we sing with passion, but whether we obey with cost. For Bonhoeffer, this was the dividing line, the test that separated spectacle from sacrifice, theater from truth, and it presses on us still. What sound will rise from your life, from your worship, from your church? The thunder of performance or the trembling of surrender? The answer will echo long after the service ends. The echo of Bonhoeffer's voice does not vanish with time. It lingers like the toll of a bell that keeps vibrating long after the strike. He forced us to look at the emptiness beneath the sound, to feel the hollowness behind the applause, to question whether Christ himself has slipped quietly out of our gatherings while we never noticed. That truth is unbearable, and yet it is the very wound that awakens the soul. It is not the end of a message, but the beginning of a mirror. Every service you enter after this moment will feel different. Every hymn you sing will carry a question. Is he here, or are we alone? And here lies the paradox Bonhoeffer left for us, that emptiness is not only a judgment, but also an invitation. A vacant sanctuary can become a womb where true worship is reborn, if only we dare to admit the absence. What looks like loss may, in fact, be the only soil in which presence can grow. It is in silence that we begin to hear. It is in exposure that we begin to heal. It is in emptiness that Christ waits to return. The danger is real, but so is the promise. The haunting becomes hope when we choose to no longer pretend. So let this not be a closing, but an awakening. Carry this unease with you. Let it sit beside you in the pew. Let it echo inside every prayer. Let it test the weight of every song. And if this voice has stirred something in you, if you sense that others need to face the same mirror, do not keep it buried. Share it. Comment with what you felt. Subscribe, not as a habit, but as a step into a community that dares to face the silence together. Because what Bonhoeffer began is not finished. And perhaps the story God is still writing waits for your voice to rise in truth.